I think I've always been a pretty good communicator, but after having raised two daughters in very close relationships between them and between us, talking about everything, going through some really hard shit together, they really taught me how to listen. Welcome to the Imperfect Men's Club podcast. I'm Mark Aylward.
I'm Jim Gurley. Thanks for being here.
This podcast is a space for men to have real, raw, and often difficult conversations to help guide middle-aged men through making hard decisions in life. Both Jim and I are mentors focused on leading consciously. Tune in every week to have honest and often humorous discussions on well-being, personal growth, and professional development.
Enjoy the show.
All right. Well, welcome back to the Imperfect Men's Club podcast. My name is Mark Aylward, and I'm here with my buddy and colleague, Jim Gurley. And today's episode, we're going to be talking all about relationships. So could be a relatively interesting and humorous episode. Let's see what happens. So, Jim, I'll lead and suggest that my current circumstances, who I am a divorced 59-year-old male who is now in a relationship with a woman for the past 2 years. And after my divorce, I don't think I dated more than a couple times for about a 10-year period of time. So I also have two adult children, female adult children, who are in the dating scene. And we discuss these things, and I meet these guys. They both have boyfriends right now who I've met and like very much, and we have a lot of fun together. And they allow me to spend time with them, so I feel grateful for that. So it's a bit of a myriad of things is who I am. Jim, how about you?
My relationship started 30 years ago, actually, in a 5-year period before that. So I've been married for 30 years, dated for 5 years. And I also have a son that's he's getting close to 30, so late 20s, single, but living with a gal. And my daughter, mid 20s, and she is I think she's living with a guy. I don't know, but but yeah, the relationship, before we get into relationship with the people around us, I think the relationship with ourselves is probably a worthy topic to get kicked off on, because the relationship with yourself often becomes very much part of the relationship with the people around you, whether that be a spouse, in my case, for 30 years, a girlfriend, or relationship with your daughter, son, and so on. So what I will say about being married for 30 years is, when people say marriage is a lot of work, everything, a relationship is work. It takes time. And I think the hardest part is reinventing yourself, or trying to get excited about something that you've seen happen so many times. And this applies to both sides. So please, I want to be clear that I'm not saying that she doesn't have the same feelings that I do, right? It goes both ways. So, but yeah, I think the most challenging part of a relationship of 30 years is making it exciting and fun in a way that is relevant to a history of 30-something years, because that's hard to do for people, for them to see somebody in a different light. And as much as I've obviously benefited from my relationship, I think it also can affect our growth, our growth of who we want to become. And it's normal to have regrets for things that you did or they did or whatever it is. But that relationships, it gets ugly, Mark. You know that.
Mine got really ugly. And, and in terms of your comment about relationships with ourselves, I think, the old cliche is that you can't love somebody else until you love yourself. And as much as that is a cliche, it's absolutely true. And I don't think enough people pay attention to that. I think a lot of people have a lot more work to do on themselves, myself included. And for some reason, we don't get around to that. I think it's analogous to me that it's easier to tell someone else how to do something than it is to do that thing yourself. It's kind of the hypocrisy involved in all that. But Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
I agree. I have a question about this. To love yourself, though, in order to love yourself, don't you have to get to know yourself? And isn't that difficult for somebody to really look at themselves, self reflect, and even get to know a person that you maybe have evolved into that you didn't even know? We often hold ourselves uh, in places of comfort. I heard another. This is an interesting talk recently about how relationships, human beings like things that they're comfortable with, or that they hold us. We hold each other in a place that's comfortable for us. That's not always for the best of somebody else. It's our responsibility. I think to create our own environment, but also how do you love yourself if you don't know yourself?
oh, you can't. I don't think you can. I think I don't know why. I suppose I'm a product of my parents and circumstances and environment, like we all are. But I've always been interested in self reflection, in questioning things about myself. And one of the things, well, one of the reasons, why you would want to be in a relationship is to be in a relationship with someone that can help you with that.
Mhm.
That can be candid without being mean. That can be helpful without being condescending. I mean,
Mhm.
if there's another cliche is that behind every great man there's a great woman, and vice versa. But to me that's all about communication. Even if you haven't got stuff figured out, if you're willing to continue to talk about it gently, kindly, generously, then you probably and never give up, right? I think mine fell apart for a lot of reasons, and I'm not suggesting I wasn't responsible for some of it, but it was pretty crazy. And I don't know that if I could have done anything different, because my ex wasn't interested in communicating about things. It was we're doing it this way, or we're not doing it. And both people have to be able to say, I'm sorry, I forgive you. I don't understand. Can we talk more about that? But if walking away, raising your voice, or changing the topic are your only options, you don't have a chance. So I think communication is critical.
Anybody, you're going to have a relationship with their family, their friends, uh, and others. That often plays into this. And in the beginning, it's going to be a little different because that's not as much a part of your life. But eventually, their circle of friends or their circle of family will become very much part of um, what your life is. And this is where expectations um, could be aligned or misaligned and cause a lot of problems.
Yeah, most of the time you do marry the family, I think, whether you want to or not. And I used to joke before my mom passed. She came and lived with me and helped me with the kids, and we helped her with, I guess, her level of infirmity as she got older. And at the time, I was the only one of my three brothers, my two brothers, the three of us, that wasn't married. So there was no wife in the middle of the communication, and it was fascinating to watch my relationship grow with my mother, because there was no one else in the way, so to
Mm.
speak. And how that dynamic plays out for both my younger brother and my older brother. My mother couldn't get that relationship right with her daughters-in-law, and it was painful, and it was unfortunate. But I was on the outside looking in, kind of smirking, like, I don't have to deal with that shit.
Yeah. Yeah. So often when you have a relationship with somebody, you're having a relationship with their past experiences,
Oh yeah.
and often, not often, all the time, men and women have daddy issues.
Yep.
It's a common thing that if you're having a relationship with somebody and they have maybe some unresolved issues or some unaware of issues, and I don't even say those in like in a negative way. But we'll talk about Dr. Wood occasionally, so I'll throw his name in there. But when I went through that program, one of the things I learned was that trauma is very normal for all human beings, um, and it's not one of those situations where you have to go back and relive it. And I think that's kind of ridiculous to some degree, but you have to at least pull it out, be aware of it, and manage that so it's not uh, making decisions for you or even causing conflict in relationships. Recently, my wife and I had a long, one of those long conversations about um, my discovery of childhood of I have 4 brothers and sisters, and a great mom, and unfortunately lost my dad last year. But a lot of what we tolerate is what we tolerated in our childhood, and that's a conversation I had to have with her. Like a lot of the things that she is projecting onto me is the relationship that she had with her mother, her father. So these are normal things, but I think the more you get them out there, the more you can get on with a more fulfilling life without all these um, roadblocks and obstacles.
I totally agree. This is one of the things that's been really fascinating about watching my children grow, 20s and early 30s now. We've been having adult conversations for a long time, and you want to be held accountable, have a conversation with one of your kids,
Mhm. Well, yeah, because there's a reflection. You start to see yourself in what they're doing, and then there's been times when I had to say, "Hey, don't do that. I did that, and it doesn't work out that good," or have those hard conversations now, because they don't get easier, and if and be willing to um, walk away, not quit or walk away from the table, but show them that you care enough about them that you're going to make an issue of this because it's important to you, and you love them enough to have the hard conversations. I think often we think that we're being kind or nice by not being honest with somebody, and it just delays the problem, and as it grows, it just becomes more of a implosion of problems down the road. So,
Yeah, no, it's so true. I think back to my marriage and how much stuff I sat on and she sat on, and because of an unwillingness to communicate, and then it festered and ballooned into something that was untenable for anybody.
mm,
And that's a real challenge when you sit on stuff. My current relationship, one of the best things about it is that there's none of that going on. And it's interesting talking to my daughters who are in relationships with me in a relationship, but my relationship is later in life, and there's no concern about children. There's no concern about getting pregnant. There's no concern about I got my own place. She's got her own place. So there's some flexibility and freedom that's embedded into the relationship. That doesn't mean it's not going to change over time, but we talk about everything. I don't ever feel like I got to be careful what I say, or I got to be careful when I say it or how I say it. I default to communicating genuinely and graciously, but I'm not walking on eggshells at all. And I spent the last few years of my marriage, every place I stepped was a pile of eggshells.
yeah, yeah,
So
great relationships are based on great communication, right?
yeah,
That's what a relationship is. Somebody that can communicate. Sometimes if you communicate and their trust isn't built, then they feel like they're being judged. They feel like they're all these things. They're triggers is what often start firing off that you're not even aware of.
yep,
So let's talk a moment about trauma, because I think trauma often is being played out in our relationships if you're not aware of it. And Dr. Wood talks about emotional trauma. It was something I had to deal with later on in life. I wasn't aware of. I think I covered those up with either business achievements or uh, sports achievements, other achievements that mask either insecurities, or they mask a persona that either outgrow, or that people hold you to
hmm
when you no longer want to be that. But how is this relationship you have with your girlfriend different than, say, your wife, based on trauma of their life or your life or things you've been through? And
well, yeah. I mean, the trauma that I brought to this current relationship was my divorce. And
interesting.
the trauma that she brought was losing her husband, just um, out of nowhere. He just dropped dead on the floor of a 7-Eleven with no warning, and she had 3 little kids. And
Hmm.
so and she fought through that trauma, and I fought through mine, and when we finally connected, we kind of flushed that out pretty good. But I think the thing that we both had in common was I am not spending the rest of my life miserable about this shit. It happened. I kind of know why it happened. I kind of don't know why it happened, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. And you refer to Dr. Wood. I've been talking to some people going through the program as well. And we'll, for our audience, we're going to get into great detail about who Dr. Wood is and what the Inspired Performance Institute is along the way. But for now, I just want to put it in context that everybody brings a level of trauma to a relationship,
Mhm.
and I could see, when I met my ex-wife's family members, father, mother, brothers, and sisters, it became very clear to me that she grew up in an environment where conflict was the way the day went. It was
Yep.
yelling and screaming and hitting and punching, and
Mhm.
I grew up where I don't think I ever heard either one of my parents even raise their voice. You
Mhm.
know, my father was stern. He was a disciplinarian. He had high expectations in terms of being polite and attentive and respectful and educated. But he never physically hit me. He never yelled at me, and he ruled very differently. And so you have these two people coming into this relationship from completely different worlds and just kind of making assumptions that we can figure this shit out. And what we didn't do, which I also think is necessary for a successful relationship, is once you decide you're in it for the long term, whatever that means to you, you got to sit down and talk about shit. You got to talk about religion. You got to talk about sex. You got to talk about money. You got to talk about children. You got to talk about expectations. My older brother did a really good job of this, and he's got a very happy marriage, I think, as at least in part as a result of it. We didn't talk about any of that stuff. We just presumed. And I got to believe most people do what I did.
Well, I think that roles are an important part of a relationship because that's why initially we were attracted to one another because relationships. It's fun. I can go deep into what I believe a relationship is. It's not what you read in magazines. It's not what I think the media tries to project what a relationship is. We marry each other to complete each other.
Mm-hmm.
Don't get me wrong, the sex is really good in the beginning and the excitement of that relationship um, is the initial attraction, but after that we're really looking for somebody that can complete us for our shortfallings or our weakness, whether we're aware of it or not. That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
And and when we get into why women marry versus why men marry, very different reasons, right? I personally think most guys uh, are very simple, and we're just trying to get laid. That's really what we're trying to do, at least in the beginning stages.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and because we're so simple and sometimes dumb, women are playing like chess and we're playing checkers. Men are very simple. We be happy. We have two hands and we have one with a remote control, the other one with a beer, and we'd rotate by sticking our hands in our pants, and that's all we would do all day long. That's just kind of how simple some guys are, in the beginning stages, particularly. If it wasn't for women, there would be nothing. Everything would be black and white, and things would be a lot simpler. But we, eventually would just club each other to death. But women play that role where we do things because of not wanting to disappoint them or trying to impress them. And big part of that. And I'll have to say, getting into, I married a career woman, so that's been challenging. Especially growing up in the time I did of what I saw my father, act at. Although my mom was a nurse, so she worked um, nights and part time. I saw a woman go to work every day, but I also was raised in a time with these traditional values of a provider, and I think that was really difficult. It still is difficult. Actually, it's hard to accept the fact that women don't need men as much as they used to for the same reasons, right? They would marry at one point out of a survival of shelter and not wasn't for companionship. That's what you're exposed to when you're growing up in the 70s or 80s. It's just it's a very different world today.
Well, I think it's always in a state of flux. I mean, to your point, my dad worked and my mom stayed home and took care of everything else. And everything else was a lot of stuff. It's a big job.
Yeah.
And but the fact that my mother also was a mother and a stay-at-home mom during a time in the 60s and 70s when feminism was creeping up and the world was changing with regard to that. I saw her lose this appreciation for the fact that she was doing what I still consider the most important job in the world, which is being a good mom. And the society kind of was, I watched it suck out of her this pride. It was like, I'm missing out. I'm missing out. I need to go get more stuff done. Being a mom is just not enough for me. And it's enough for a lot of women, and it's not enough for others, but it should be enough for everybody because it's a lot. And I talk to my daughters now because this whole blurring of the lines between genders and what is a man and how do you feel about masculinity and femininity and all these things are just confusing. And both my daughters have their own businesses, so balancing their own business with finding a suitable long-term uh, mate, if you will, that's a huge challenge for them, and their heads spin when it comes to what should I consider important. Can I have all of this, or can I only have some of this? So I don't. That's a generational in terms of what those challenges and conflicts are, but I think it happens to every generation because things are always changing.
I think the difference is, I will say, is that our fathers didn't talk to us the way we talk to our children. So a lot of this is in a very positive way. We've evolved and learned from this, and that was very uncommon, um, at least in my childhood. So,
Yeah, no,
but
my father was is he's still with us, 92 years old and in great shape. He's always been one of my best friends, you know, and even though he was a stern, manly, disciplinarian, military guy, captain, fighter pilot, you know, he was the man, you know, in most of his world, and he was the man when he came home. But you know, he was also very gentle. He's also a very gentle man, very kind man, very
was he
saintly man.
gentle and kind to your mother?
He was gentle. He's gentle and kind to everyone. Yeah, I
Hmm.
my mother. And in hindsight, right, you can always trace people's behavior back, and it's obvious in hindsight, right? Her mother was a lovely. My grandmother was a lovely woman, but she was weak in her relationship, and that was because her mother, when apparently my grandfather slapped her one time, and I don't know this to be true or not, but it was a story that somehow stuck from someone. She ran home to her mom, and her mom apparently said, "You get back there with your husband. You belong with your husband." So the message she was getting was, you got to take whatever's coming because women are supposed to treat men this way. It doesn't matter how men treat women. And of course, that's bullshit. But my mom
Yeah.
watched this happen, and what I saw was her dad was an asshole. My grandfather, I don't remember him well. I just remember him being grumpy and mean all the time, and didn't take very good care of my grandmother from a treatment standpoint. And so I think my mother was insecure as a result of that. She was
Mhm.
beautiful, great athlete, very talented, very funny, very on the outside, she looked great. On the inside, she was insecure and depressed most of her life in hindsight. And so you put a guy like that in a room with a gal like that, that's not oil and vinegar. That's oil and water.
Yeah.
And
No, I thought of two things, Mark.
yeah,
One, why it has we have benefited and have served us, as a society, by having women in a position of greater power by earning an income, right? That we often forget the benefits of that, right? Because what your mother went through is not uncommon at that time. Women did not have the ability to support themselves. They really were a nurse, which my mother was, a secretary, or a teacher. Those were the three career paths for a woman, in that period of time, right? 40s and 60s. So there's that. And then the other thing that, and I mentioned this before, when we're in a relation with somebody, they're going to eventually project their life onto us. So if your mother experienced a bad example, let's say, I don't want to say your grandfather's bad, then it was just a matter of time before your mother probably unknowingly was going to turn your father into that villain or that person. Whether she was aware of it or not, if you're not having those conversations with yourself to be aware of it, then eventually you're going to project that onto the other person, and that's often a repetitive problem that will go into your second marriage, your third marriage, or your fourth marriage. It doesn't go away unless you're self-aware. And that's what I think, based on what you've told me, what's different about you, and in even sharing those experiences with your children to make sure they don't make the same mistakes. But
Well, again, it's interesting talking to my daughters and my son, for that matter, about relationships. This issue of roles that you mentioned earlier, I think they're all blurred, and I think that's very confusing for young people. And if the expectation is you're going to get married, raise children, and stay home and take care of those children, and that expectation is projected by society as a very valuable, critical, important, difficult role, then that's an easier, more black and white way of looking at things. Now, if you're a woman that doesn't want any part of that in that world, then I suppose you'd have some challenges. But I think role definition in relationships is, I say this about everyone else that I know that has a relationship. The only thing that matters in that relationship is that those two people agree on important things and have a respect for one another and a love for one another. They could be doing stuff that you would never do. That doesn't matter. They just have to agree on what they're doing. And I think it circles back around to the very beginning of the call, where it's like, you got to talk about the important stuff early. And
yeah,
to your point, it's like, it's so romantic at the beginning, it's so exciting at the beginning, that you're like, we'll get to that stuff later.
yeah,
Too late. you know
yeah, yeah. It reminds me of a conversation I was having with a good friend recently about currency. And men in general, particularly our generation of men, see the currency is always monetary. It's money. Everything is based on the value of money. Our self-worth is based on money, our careers, everything is money. What I find that women have a different currency. Not that money's not important, don't get me wrong. But it's not solely based on dollars. It's not 100% money for women. In fact, in some ways, women, I think, make money easier because they're not so obsessed by it like men. And I think that what makes them good often in their careers is because they're not trying to um, satisfy their ego as much as focusing on the task at hand. And that's why they're great organizers for that reason. But yeah, what are your thoughts about currencies in a relationship and the different types of currencies?
yeah, I mean, keeping score, keeping track, tit for
Score,
tat. Yeah.
yeah, that's a currency, right?
Yeah, it is.
Of
It is.
what?
Well, I mean, the mean things that were said. I remember. I don't know. I can't be alone. It's a guy thing, like not asking for directions or being stubborn or whatever, wanting to control stuff. Um, it's. I would get into an argument, and literally an hour after the argument was over, I had no idea what we were arguing about. And I always got the impression, and it's not necessarily a generality, but it might be, that she was storing up memories for
Mm,
later.
yep.
Like, I'm going to pull that out later. That's a good one. I'm not going to use that right now. And I've always said, I think women develop a set of manipulative verbal skills because they don't have the physical ability to beat the shit out of one another that men do.
Interesting.
We can beat the shit out of each other with our fists, and then get up and forgive each other, and walk away like nothing ever happened, and maybe become good friends.
Yep.
um Women, it's frowned upon for girl fights, even though everybody jokes about loving them to see one in high school. It was I think that's a natural tendency that is female in nature, because it's a survival skill you
S-
know
Sure. And that emotion could evolve into rage and violence, but that doesn't have to be physical violence.
Yep.
I think sometimes, uh, uh, well, first of all, I just in general believe a good ass kicking is good for everybody once in a while, whether it's physically or emotionally. I remember when I was growing up, um, have you ever been punched in the face? It's an interesting question, because if you have, you'll know exactly what I mean.
Yep.
When you get punched in the face, your perspective on life changes at that very instant. and going back to your point earlier, Mark, when you're particularly a young man, I'm not suggesting we all start punching each other in the face, um, but you know where your place is once you get punched in the face with that person, and you can get on with life in the playground or whatever else. And that doesn't happen because obviously we're not punching each other, especially with a woman. I've never touched a woman in my life, and there's times when I want to, but you just don't do that, right? But it does leave, like you said, some unresolved issues, and they store that, and sometimes for years, and you don't even know for decades, shit that you said or did, uh, that you weren't even aware of, but that they held in and used at that right moment. So and this goes also back to where I believe women in general emotionally communicate things, and men try to communicate things logically, and those are two different currencies. They just don't add up, and it often becomes a complete shit show of nothing if you don't have those relationships. If you don't value what each other brings to the relationship. But
Well, I think, so many thoughts swirling around in my head, but I think, and again, one of the things that I think I've always been a pretty good communicator, but after having raised two daughters, in very close relationships between them and between us, talking about everything, going through some really hard shit together, they really taught me how to listen. And I think one of the other keys to successful relationships is to listen. And I put the burden of that more on the guy than the girl, because in my humble experience, most women don't want you to solve anything. They don't want you to fix anything except maybe, shit that breaks around the house. But but they want you to listen.
yeah,
And they want you to listen attentively and give a shit. And I think that when you say it, it's such a simple concept, but we're not we're not bred that way. I was the captain of pretty much every team I played on. I've always been a leader. I was the owner of the company. I was the guy that trained everybody. I was the motivational guy. I've always been the guy who's in charge and who is in control. And that doesn't bode well necessarily to bring that shit to a relationship. You kind of have to drop the control thing and drop the talking thing and just surrender, not control, and listen, not talk. And man, if you can do those two things, you got a good chance.
well, Mark, I agree with you. And what you said was they want you to listen to them, but doesn't everybody want to be listened to? If I was to just add to expand on what you're saying, what we all want is pretty much the same, and that is to matter, and to be wanted, to be needed, and to be relevant. Women, that's extreme. That's even more important to them, because they want to know where they stand with you. And if we don't communicate that to them, then that's it. But I think that applies especially to men as we age. It's almost like the roles reverse. We become more like women, and they became more like men, and we change as time goes on. So I think everybody wants to be listened to. Everybody wants to matter, and everybody wants to belong. And women are just very naturally. That's what a family is. And then the other thing I would say is what I say to all guys that are either thinking about getting married or uh, being persuaded to get married. Um, this is as far as the pecking order in life. Before you get married, you are the most important thing to a woman. Particularly in the dating phase, and then as you get close to, let's just say, a proposal of marriage, as soon as she gets the ring on the finger, you just became the second most important thing in the world, because at that point, that wedding is far more important than you. And in fact, they could rent a mannequin at that stage, because you're just playing a role until that day comes. So that's how you start. You start the best you'll ever get uh, is right before you drop the ring on her finger. And then you get married, and you're thinking, great, you're good. You're just trying to get laid for the honeymoon or whatever you think you're doing. Um, and then what happens? The first child comes into the relationship. Now you went from what, 1 to 0 to 0. Now you're going to 0 2. in life. So the most important thing uh, is that child. And by the way, the wedding day, it was all about the family. Again, you don't even have to show up. They could just rent somebody that looks like you, and nobody would do a difference because the family really was having that wedding for them and her, not you. That's just the way it is. And that'll go on for what, a year or 2 years until you get married. But once they have the baby, you go below zero. And then once they have a second baby, then you go even below. And you wait until 18 years before you're actually back to where you started before the whole thing started. I say that in humor, but I also say that in, hey, that's just evolution. And you almost, I think real men get comfortable with that. And and we need them and they need us. But I say it jokingly, but I also say it in, you have to be patient. Um, and marriage should be like a dance. It shouldn't be a competition. And a good dance is not a one is not dominating another person, right? It becomes one as they move, but a man needs to lead, and a woman then also leads him, and there's no push and pull. It just becomes this kind of beautiful thing. And there's some great books and stuff on it. We'll talk about it maybe another time. But that would be my one advice about relationships and marriages. It really needs to become a dance and not a competition.
I don't remember the guy. I think he was a Jewish guy, or maybe a rabbi, and he was on the Dennis Prager show, who I think is fantastic. And they were doing the man woman hour. That's Prager does the man woman hour once a week, and he does the male female hour. No, the happiness hour, and another one. Really good segments. And so a woman called in and was complaining about her relationship with her husband. I don't get this. I don't get that. I don't get this. And the rabbi said, well, I would recommend that you go back into the relationship and try to say, what can you do for him? What can you do for him? How can you be a better wife for him?
Mm-hmm.
How can you bring more to the relationship? Because when you do that, it will automatically trigger him feeling an obligation to give more back to you. And you take control of that situation by that, not controlling him, but by stop saying what you're not getting and focus on what you can give. And I just thought that was spectacular, you
It's
know?
great, great stuff. Men are simple beings. Again, once we get our basic needs met, we're much simpler. But that's why we need each other too. You know, women add flavor. They add the femininity is such an important part of that. So is the masculinity. I really think we need to get to a place where we're celebrating that. We're not trying to back to competing that one is better than the other. And I believe we're in this weird, awkward transition at this moment in time where we got to figure this out. Otherwise, um, we're just going to continue to grow further apart. And you're starting to see that, right? You're starting to see guys in their 50s just saying, fuck it. They're just not worth it anymore. You know, it's just not worth it financially. It's not worth it. And they're not even getting laid like they used to. So that's a whole other conversation of sex, you know, as you move into these different stages of our life, you know, 40s, 50s, 60s.
Well, I think you're exactly right. I think to try and argue against someone's DNA, someone's embedded, thousands of year old historical man does this, go kill, bring the food back, do your part in contributing to making the kids and then taking care of the kids from a survival and a safety standpoint, but not necessarily a nurturing standpoint. That's like who a man is. And if you try to say that's not the case, or if you try to change that man, that's conflict. You're bumping up against Mother Nature, up against God. And then and conversely, if you're trying to make masculine a woman, or by the way she looks, or the way she cuts her hair, or what she calls herself, or the way she dresses, and then as well impact her role as a woman, a nurturer, a caregiver, right? You
Mhm.
try and change that, that's like trying to push a huge boulder up a mountain. That's going to break. And that's where we are now. And I think there's a lot of confusion about gender and roles and masculinity and femininity. This is making relationships far more difficult than they need to be, because even without all this stuff, they're difficult, they're challenging, they're work, and they're wonderful when they work. But yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that we need to stop trying to turn men into something they're not, and turn women into something they're not, and just kind
Yeah.
of be happy and accept your role. And I've seen some incredibly strong women with some really cool guys, and it, to your point, they're dancing, they're not fighting,
Mhm.
they're accepting of their roles. There's a level of compromise, and what comes from that is just enjoyment.
My advice to anybody, man, we're speaking of men particularly, is to understand women. They're complex and they go through different periods of their life, but they also um, naturally go through different emotions at different times of the month of their life. That's a very normal part of a woman is. And what this it was the gal that wrote the book did marriage counseling, and her conclusion was very similar to what yours was. In the end, um, American women particularly had an expectation for a man that was completely unrealistic, and they wanted him to play these. And she does a really good job laying out these different characters that women are attracted to at different times of their life and at different stages, often related to their environment. One being the artist kind of guy. Yeah. So the other one being a provider, the other one being a warrior. And she lays out these characteristics in these personality types of men. um, and it's very true, right? A woman can completely change maybe her either sexual desires or her just by who comes into her life at that time.
Yeah, and there's love involved, and intimacy involved, and all those other things that we're not supposed to talk about,
Yeah. So
because we're weak if we do. But yeah, no, I think just in wrapping stuff up, I think the key to a good relationship, the number one is communication. And I think for the men out there, I thought I was pretty good at this until I discovered that I could get a lot better, and that's the listening piece.
yeah,
And then the relationship I'm in right now, I don't I don't really ever feel like I'm being taken advantage of, or I'm doing more than she's doing, or I never got the sense that anyone's keeping track of anything. And that's far, far, far different than the one I was in before.
I do have a question about that because this is back to being alone. We often forget the feeling of loneliness. How long were you alone? And again, I'm one of those people at this stage, and even have friends that kind of like being alone, like having their own space at times. I'm not suggesting that I want to be alone all the time, but how much of this is playing into loneliness, particularly through
I,
the pandemic, and even a lot of women that have careers um, often are alone and want a relationship, but are so occupied with their professions and all these things going on in their life that they don't make time to have these relationships. But let's talk about loneliness.
yeah, it's an interesting topic. Most of the people that I've seen that got divorced, including my ex, they jump right into another relationship because they don't want to be alone. And
Interesting.
I'd love to know the stats on that, like codependence or whatever you might call that. But um, I was the opposite. I was like, there's no fucking way I'm getting back into a relationship right now.
Hmm.
I am fucking broken, and I got a dog.
Yeah. Yeah.
and 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 I he passed a couple of years ago, and Farley was his name. He was awesome. But it's I just felt like I got to work on myself, because I could jump into another relationship right now, but I honestly feel like it would be unfair
Yeah.
because I'm busted up. So I'm fortunate, Jim, as you are. Clearly, I got a great family. I got great kids. I got good friends. I've always been real comfortable on my own. Not that I didn't feel lonely here and there when I dropped my daughter off at college, and I was now coming back to an empty home. When I was driving back from New York where I dropped her off, and I did not see this coming at all. And I got home and I walked into the house, and it was no one there, and it hit me like a punch in the face, and I just started crying. But I immediately, after I stopped sobbing and picked myself up, I immediately said, "Okay, that's a thing that you need to do something about, because that is not a feeling I ever want to feel again." And so I started going back to church. I started doing yoga. I started doing other things, going to the beach, and dating was not one of them, and then I went on a date, and it sucked. And so I tested it every once in a while. I just wasn't ready. And the way this new relationship happened was, as I described earlier, it was like it has a meant to be thing to it, kind of, and
Yeah.
the
Well,
way
that
it happened. But
right, Mark, that loops right back into the beginning of the conversation about the relationship with yourself. You established a new relationship with yourself, and maybe um, that time alone, gave you the opportunity to really understand yourself and a self evaluation. And back to loneliness, I think there's as many lonely people in a relationship as there is people not in a relationship,
oh
particularly
yeah,
marriages.
yeah,
And in fact, I would suggest that the majority of relationships or marriages are lonely, lonely places.
yeah. I think physical proximity does not mean there's not loneliness. I mean, and being alone has nothing to do with physical proximity. It's a kind of a soul thing, and that's one of the feelings. The worst feelings I had towards the end of my marriage was, I'm so alone here, even surrounded by all these people. I'm just on my own.
Yeah, it's a good wrap.
All right, thanks, Jim. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thanks for listening.